Good morning, and welcome to this Friday's Huessy seminar. We offer 2 to 3 of these deterrence seminars every month, usually at 10 a.m. Eastern on Fridays. My name is Alex Littlefield, and I'm a Chief of Staff here at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS for short. And our president, James Petrosky, is the founder, and he's also here in the audience. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank, and our motto is Think Deterrence. We live our motto of Think Deterrence through education, research, and consulting. To get to know us better, you may listen to our podcast, The NIDS View and NIDS Knowledge. Check out our courses at the NIDS Academy, read our articles at Global Security Review, and follow upcoming events such as this one at you can find all of that at thinkdeterrence.com. This event, these webinars that we have, you are able to interact directly with the speakers, so you can raise your hand with the emoji icon, and then I will give you the mic and the camera so you can ask them directly. If you're camera shy or mic shy, then feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. Normally our host is Peter, but today we're honored to have our Vice President for Education, Curtis McGiffin, and he's also one of the co-founders of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, because Peter is today on the other side of the table. And over to you, Curtis.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome all to my chance to host my first opportunity to host the Huessy event. We can't have Peter Huessy host his own event when he's on the other side of the fence. So I'm gonna pinch hit here and hopefully get where we need to be. So welcome all of you, and let me do the honor here of introducing our two great speakers. Mr. Peter Huessy is a president of his own defense consulting firm, Geostrategic Analysis, which he founded back in 1981. He's also a senior fellow here at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. He previously served as a director of strategic deterrence studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and was a senior defense consultant for the National Defense University Foundation for 22 years. With over 50 years of experience, Mr. Huessy has worked as an expert defense and national security analyst, monitoring developments in nuclear deterrence, ICBM modernization, nuclear arms control, and overall nuclear modernization strategies. If you're interested, you can also listen to Peter recently on the John Batchelor Show earlier this week. And his latest op-ed is called No First Use Nuclear Weapons Policy is Dangerous, which you can find on warriormaven.com. Our second guest is the Honorable Frank C. Miller, who is a principal at the Scrowcroft Group, providing strategic and tactical advice on defense, national security, foreign affairs, and intelligence policy. He is a recognized expert in nonproliferation, nuclear deterrence, and arms control. With over 30 years in the U.S. government, Mr. Miller spent 22 years in the Department of Defense and served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and as senior director for defense policy and arms control on the National Security Council staff. He currently serves as the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group on the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group and was a member of the Defense Policy Board from 2008 to 2020. He is also a member of the Atlantic Council on Foreign Relations and a director he was a member on the Council on Foreign Relations and a director on the Atlantic Council. He's a chairman emeritus of the Charles Stark Draper Laboratory, with additional roles on the boards of Airbus, U.S. Space and Defense, and the Sandia National Laboratory. And finally, I would like to point out that Frank served on the America Strategic Posture Commission. So if those areas interest you, please include them in your questions. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We are excited to hear your comments on today's topics, where we'll, discuss a little bit about the current nuclear landscape, both good and bad, and some of the challenges to the with the effectiveness of America's response. So, Peter, over to you, sir, for your comments.
Thank you very much, Curtis, and welcome everybody to this event that NIDS is hosting. I'm going to lay out what I see as the nuclear landscape, and it begins with the breathtaking acceleration of Chinese, North Korean, and Russian nuclear force modernization, And what's that done is pushed the United States into reviewing its security policy and defense strategies, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons. And that has led to two recent congressionally mandated commissions, which have both unanimously warned of the necessity of significant new investments in the U.S. military budget for both conventional and nuclear forces. This is taking place, however, within the context of a series of what I call parallel developments with the overarching reality that Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are increasingly joining forces to upend the international norms and law, engaged in armed aggression and terrorism, while at the same time raking in billions in criminal behavior. Now, these four nations are pursuing a coordinated campaign of what the Chinese call unrestricted warfare, including attacks against the United States and its allies in the Middle East from Iran and its terror proxies. My understanding, it numbers 170 such attacks from October 2023 through January 2024. We also have attacks by China on the Philippines and around Taiwan in the South China Sea. We have multiple threats from North Korean missile launches toward the Republic of Korea and Japan. We have the disruption of ocean-borne freight traffic by the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, in coordination occasionally with China, Iran, and Russia. And then you have Russia's lethal and what I consider criminal attacks against Ukraine's civilian society and infrastructure. Now, the massive nuclear build by all four of these countries provides, in my view, an umbrella under which they can have a coordinated campaign against the United States and the West. And they use the nuclear threat or the nuclear hammer as a means of blackmail and coercion, as the Foster Commission said, in order to keep the United States out of the fight. Now, we have to reckon with all of this to successfully restore deterrence or sustain it, depending on your point of view. And I'm going to go through 5 ongoing nuclear developments that are most worrisome. 1, the Russian-initiated war in Ukraine is now in its 3rd year, but it's been accompanied by, as Mark Schneider has pointed out, multiple dozens of reckless threats by Moscow to use nuclear weapons. But the problem is that more and more people think Moscow's threats have become viewed as a bluff, which has some problems. 2, there is an apparent change in Russian nuclear doctrine that, again, Mark Schneider has laid out, which would allow for the early use of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict should a nuclear power assist in the conventional conflict, and that has heightened nuclear dangers. 3, there's also a growing tendency by the United States to advocate restraint and negotiations during a conflict to avoid escalation, including carrying out only proportionate responses to enemy aggression, to avoid escalatory actions, and especially stay completely away from either the threat of or the use of nuclear force. And 4th, there's pressure from both the far left and far right, which I've written about in my weekly ICBM EAR report, and that is to jettison America's longstanding policy of extending its conventional and nuclear deterrent over its allies in Europe and Asia. Most particularly, this narrative is growing that any retaliatory use of nuclear weapons by the United States in defense of its allies would quickly escalate to all-out nuclear war, and therefore it is simply impractical. And this, in turn, on number 5, calls into question whether U.S. nuclear deterrent policy will be taken seriously by our adversaries if one is running around saying we're not going to use such weapons under any circumstances. The pressure grows to denigrate the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. security policy and further unilaterally reduce U.S. nuclear force levels toward the goal of zero nuclear weapons, but also to undermine and vitiate the whole idea of nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, there are some good nuclear news that may help the United States. 1, very large bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress to support significantly increasing the capability of America's nuclear forces, and in particular cruise missiles, including warhead levels, and improving the overall nuclear triad. 2, there's an equally strong bipartisan majority in Congress to support significantly increasing the capability of America's conventional forces, particularly our deterrent, such things as long-range prompt conventional strike at hypersonic speeds. 3, a very large number of senior deterrent experts, which I include my friend Frank Miller, are advocating a robust U.S. response to these armed threats, including the possible escalation with the aim of winning even should the use of nuclear weapons be contemplated, In short, they take deterrence seriously. Fourth, my belief is both the Air Force and Navy have committed senior leaders seriously looking at building a new nuclear deterrent, even while sustaining a very old legacy deterrent, a job that is very difficult to do, but which I believe, as Frank will outline, we have hit some roadblocks and potholes. Five, the end of the New START agreement may, according to some analysts, finally remove the fiction that Russia is complying with the terms of the agreement and allow the U.S. to build the required deterrent without relying on Moscow's consent in an arms control deal. And I think that's very, very important. Again, I go back to my friend Mark Schneider, has recently written for NIP an extraordinary review of the arms control history between the United States and the first Soviet Union and then Russia. And Dave Trachtenberg of NIP, along with Keith Payne and others, have previously this summer written a companion piece that goes through the problems that arms control gives the United States. Now, finally, there's a mixed factor, and that is, while there exist a myriad of interpretations as to what China's nuclear strategy entails, ranging from a requirement to have an assured retaliatory capability, an escalate to win theater nuclear capability, a no first use posture, a response to U.S. missile defenses, or the development of a course of nuclear force capability, including a preemptive first strike stance, the overall direction is toward Washington undertaking a serious assessment of China's hegemonic ambitions. And if you take this all together, the future landscape looks treacherous at best. And although there is an emerging national sentiment in the United States and among our allies that our nuclear forces and strategy must modernize, whether a path through these geostrategic landmines can be found remains, in my view, in doubt. And now my friend and colleague Franklin Miller, will now address what the U.S. needs to do to sustain and improve and enhance our nuclear deterrent and the challenge that we face in doing so. Over to you, Frank.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks all for being here. I'm pleased to be here. I will use my usual non-controversial style to talk about what I see is going on. So it's about 11 days before the election, and I think it's a good time to take stock of where we are and what the next administration, whether it's Harris or Trump, is going to bring us. I think the good news from a policy perspective is that things largely are finally on track. First, we've recognized again that we need allies. The U.S. is vital to allies' national security, but allies are also vital to our own national security. See the report of the 2022 to 2023 congressionally mandated Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission on this. Second, we've finally realized, even if belatedly, that the threat to global security is posed by Putin and Xi. Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine dispelled all doubts about the dangerous imperial ambitions of this murderous thug. Seeking to reestablish the USSR and reestablish a Soviet-Russian sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, 600,000 dead and wounded don't faze him in the slightest. In the Pacific, Xi continues his quest for regional dominance, that includes hegemony of the South China Sea, expropriation of the EEZs of littoral states, including that of U.S. allies, and the conquest of Taiwan. And his buildup of nuclear forces has been described as breathtaking. And oh, by the way, Putin and Xi have signed a treaty of friendship without limits. So we've now belatedly recognized the danger these two dictators pose. In 2023, the Strategic Posture Commission called for revising U.S. national security policy to be able to deter and defeat Russia and China simultaneously, if necessary. And recent statements by senior White House and DoD officials indicate that U.S. nuclear deterrence policy has been modified to reflect this unfortunate reality. Third, NATO has gotten stronger. Putin's vigorous policies compelled longtime neutral Sweden and Finland to join the alliance, measurably strengthening our posture and capability in the Baltic Sea and in the Arctic. Fourth, it appears the political battle, which spanned 3 administrations, has been won. to modernize the triad. Fifth, Congress has mandated the creation of a program to design, build, and deploy a nuclear-tipped sea-launched cruise missile to strengthen our ability to deter Russian and Chinese nuclear adventurism in regional conflicts. And finally, and while the jury is still out on this, I believe the majority view is that arms control is not going to save us in the near term. Russia is a serial cheater on all of the treaties Putin either inherited or signed, and she just isn't interested. Arms control is now recognized as an adjunct to a strong deterrent, not a replacement for one. And gradually, that recognition has sunk in that if there is to be meaningful nuclear arms control in the future, we must break away from the Cold War orthodoxy that only intercontinental weapons should be captured. Any future negotiation and treaty should capture all deployed nuclear weapons, short and medium range, as well as long range ones. Wars start in the theater, not over the polls. But policy, however well designed and promulgated, counts for very little if it is not implemented. And here we as a nation have fallen down. Well, much of what I'm going to talk about now occurred over not only the last 4 years, but the roots of failure for it go back decades as multiple administrations allowed the nation's defense industrial base capacity and expertise to wither based on the mistaken notion that the demise of the USSR meant the end of history and a world of peace and democracy for all. Sadly, that wasn't the case. And having won the political battle to rebuild, however belatedly, our aging nuclear triad, the Air Force and the Navy have dropped the ball with regard to moving out to actually do so. Let's talk about the triad first. The Air Force has failed us completely by botching the Minuteman replacement program. While industry's development of the new Sentinel ICBM appears to be proceeding well, the Air Force totally mismanaged the task of planning for the modification of Minuteman silos to house them and for upgrading the NC-3 to the silos. These inexcusable lapses led to a major Nunn-McCurdy breach. In the worst case, this cost growth emboldens the longtime opponents of ICBM modernization, encouraging them to take one more shot at killing the program. In an intermediate bad outcome, the cost growth will cause the number of Sentinels to be reduced. Another example of lack of focus and poor decision-making involves the B-21. While again, development of the plane appears to be proceeding well, General Alvin, the Air Force Chief of Staff, recently announced that the service would cap the program at 100 aircraft. No one I know in the nuclear community understands this as our combined requirement for nuclear and conventional bombers, particularly given that we now must be capable of waging war simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific. No one understands this arbitrary cap. It's time for the Air Force to get its act together, and the next administration must make this happen, and quickly. The Air Force is not alone. The Navy has consistently stated that the new Columbia-class SSBN is its highest priority program. Yet that program is now slipping to the right, with the first boat scheduled to arrive 12 to 18 months late. This places a huge burden on the aging Ohio-class boats, and it raises the specter of a gap if one of the Ohios needs to be retired sooner than currently anticipated. There are, of course, mitigating circumstances here. The submarine industrial base was severely impacted by COVID and hasn't yet recovered. But that needs to be remedied, and the next administration needs to ensure the Navy devotes increased attention to helping the submarine building industry to recover and to reduce the time necessary to build both the Columbias and the Virginia-class SSNs. And while the discussion in the Huessy forums has generally been on strategic nuclear forces, I also want to call out some failures of some critical conventional programs. Our conventional forces are the first line of deterrence. If our conventional forces are strong, they can deter the initial stages of Russian and/or Chinese aggression, and the issue of nuclear attack won't even arise. But here, too, there have been consistent failures. The Air Force doesn't have enough tankers. Tankers needed to support nuclear bomber forces and nuclear command and control aircraft. Tankers needed to support U.S. forces in the Pacific, a dauntingly large geographic theater, as well as simultaneously supporting our forces in NATO. This isn't news, but for 4 long years, Secretary Kendall has kicked the can down the road, occasionally offering the prospect of a bridge tanker option, but never acting on it. And because the international situation has deteriorated over these 4 years, the Air Force has a greater tanker shortfall today than it did in 2021. And as a result, we are more at risk. Second, after DoD issued a defense industrial policy last year, pledging to be a good and consistent customer, which would work with industry to provide steady acquisitions rather than the feast or famine practices which caused industry uncertainty regarding workforce and facility management, the Navy dropped the submarine from its FY 2025 budget request. So much for consistency. And our SSN force is well below what is necessary to provide a deterrent in the North Atlantic and the Pacific. And similarly, the Navy's mismanagement of ship and submarine overhauls has resulted in idling badly needed assets for years. Speaking of the Navy, Secretary Del Toro has been orchestrating a campaign to delay and ultimately undo congressional direction to create, build, and deploy a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Del Toro's public comments on this betray a total understanding of the role of the U.S. submarine force and of regional nuclear deterrence. Such ignorance, especially at high levels, is unacceptable. In the same vein, the Navy, while complaining for over a decade about Russian and Chinese anti-access area denial capabilities, has approached the best countermeasure, the hypersonic conventional prompt strike missile, as if it is a luxury. The old-fashioned word lollygagging comes to mind. Deployment will occur in dribs and drabs until mid in next decade. At the same time, our combatant commanders are deeply worried about the next 3 to 4 years rather than mid next decade. In fact, there seems to be a major disconnect between COCOM needs and what the service secretariats are providing. And as a food for thought question, I wonder, why do we still have service secretariats in the acquisition business? So how can we move forward? What should the next administration, Harris or Trump, focus on? It's my view it should not focus on fixing nuclear deterrence policy. We don't need a new NPR, which after all will consume a year or more to complete, and another 2 years of work through the bureaucracy in the forms of presidential guidance, SecDef guidance, chairman's guidance, before being translated into plans. As I said at the beginning, I believe the policy we have today is the right one, and it corresponds to the dangers we face. The new team, whoever they are, will want to review it, of course, but they can do that expeditiously and move on to the real problem, which is failed implementation. They should, however, quickly decide that the New START treaty will be allowed to expire and will not be carried on in any sort of no undercut way after that. So I'd recommend that the new Secretary of Defense take a page from the late Cap Weinberger's book. Weinberger instituted a series of reviews at his level of the big three programs of the Reagan Triad modernization effort. He would require the service secretary, the service chief, and the program manager to report to him every 3 months on program status and on efforts to fix any apparent problems. The services have now proven themselves untrustworthy. The new SecDef should institute Weinberger-style reviews for Sentinel, Columbia, and B-21, and probably LRSO for good measure. And while he or she is at it, I would recommend similar reviews for SSN production, conventional prompt strike, tanker, and SLCM-N. And those reviews should do the following: help the 2 submarine producers increase their output as quickly as possible, accelerate CPS deployment even through a stopgap non-traditional means such as armored box launchers on large decks, immediately initiate a bridge tanker program and fill in the gaps in the inventory with leased tankers, and assure and accelerate SLCM-N deployment. Given the probability of further delays in the modernization program, the new administration should provide sufficient funding to ensure existing deployed systems such as NC-3 and Ohio-class SSBNs can operate past their currently planned retirement dates as technically feasible. both to ensure our continued ability to hold the Russian and Chinese target base at risk and to hedge against premature retirement of an existing platform or platforms. The administration should be prepared in January 2026 to upload in-service Minuteman and Trident II missiles, restore the start-neutered SLBM tubes on Ohio SSBNs to nuclear deterrent rolls, and load Trident II missiles into them, reconvert to a nuclear roll B-52 bombers that were rendered incapable of launching a nuclear weapon under New START. Plan to deploy the Sentinel ICBM in a MIRV configuration. Increase the planned number of deployed long-range standoff weapons. Increase the planned number of B-21s and tankers. Increase the planned production of Columbia SSBNs beyond 12 and their Trident ballistic missile systems, and accelerate development and deployment of D5 Life Extension 2. Accelerate efforts to develop advanced countermeasures to adversary integrated air and missile defenses, and initiate planning and preparations for portions of the future bomber fleet to be on continuous alert status in time for the B-21 full operational capability date. Finally, the administration should get serious about a defense industrial base policy. It should rapidly review the 2023 document, update it and revise it as necessary, promulgate it, and immediately convene a Secretary of Defense level summit with the CEOs of the major defense firms to develop and implement ways to expand the base and make it more responsive and agile. A policy without forces is meaningless. We need to get with the program. Thanks.
Curtis, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Frank. Appreciate those comments. Very candid discussion here. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'll start with the first one, if you don't mind. I really appreciate, Frank, that very comprehensive assessment and recommendation list. I wanted to get your feel, though. I didn't hear your thoughts on the progression via NNSA and pit production. We just recently had our first new pit in 35 years. There was a bunch of fanfare over this. So It took us 6 years to get to the first pit. So we have maybe 5 more years to get to the other 79 to meet the requirement. I'm curious on your thoughts on that and whether or not we're going to get there. What kind of effort should we give to this sort of deal? Do we need an Elon Musk to sort of get into the pit building business in order to get where we need to be? Are we that delayed? And just as an aside question, while I have the floor, you note that we don't need a new NPR, and I understand the frustration of the bureaucratic process that takes so long to do that. But there are a number of things in the current NPR that, in my mind, would need to be edited out in order to do the things that you want to do. Maybe primarily the statement in there that we must continue to sort of lessen the importance of our nuclear deterrent in our overall strategic posture, and sort of these sorts of ideas, these sort of idealistic efforts to get to disarmament in a world that is sort of properly understood, even in that document, as one that's really not prepared to get to disarmament. So those are my 2 questions for you. Looking forward to your response, sir.
Let me take the second first. As far as I'm concerned, the 2022 NPR is a dead letter.
Okay.
The world changed.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that kind of effort is meaningful anymore. What I would go with is the new presidential policy as described by Pranay Vadi and Vipin Narang, that says the new guidance says we have to hold Russia and China at risk simultaneously. And we should go on from there. And we should allow New START to expire in 2026 without any further restrictions on us. And that's where we go forward. We hold at risk with the enemy leadership values. That's what counts. To me, those are the only guiding principles. It's the forces that really bother me because I'm afraid that we aren't putting things out into the field as quickly as we need to, which leads to your second or your first question, in all fairness, NNSA. In part, NNSA's problem, as I understand it, is that it lacks the same kinds of workers that the submarine construction force needs. Skilled welders who are capable of working on nuclear systems. People who are good, skilled, trained to work at concrete and rebar to build new facilities that are going to be nuclear certified. That's clearly a problem. But I think, and no disrespect to Jill Ruby, I think she's done all that she could. NNSA has money it can spend. It needs to go out and scour the countryside and spend a lot more money on trying to hire new workers, like the submarine force is doing, and to get on with the building of facilities. And if you don't have new facilities, you can't build new weapons. So I believe we need to really make that a national priority. And I mean, since you asked the question, and I'm on a rant, the other thing is, if you go back and you look at what Franklin Roosevelt did, as far as the arsenal of democracy, he didn't call for, I'd like to have an incremental increase. He said, I want 50,000 planes in the next year. I want 12 aircraft carriers, whatever the number was.
Right.
We need to start focusing on output, not input. We tend to focus on dollars, even for NATO, 2%, 3%. That's input. Let's focus on output, and let's have the new administration focus on output, because that's what the combatant commanders need. The combatant commanders need systems in the field. The Navy's lollygagging on conventional prompt strikes, ridiculous. Secretary Del Toro says, I want more surface ships. Well, the surface ships can't survive if he can't suppress the A2AD. So what the hell is he doing? Anyway,
Right.
So I think that's it. I mean, put a big red X through the 2022 NPR. Get on with the current policy.
Well, very good. I appreciate that. I think what you're saying is we need a Manhattan Project for our Manhattan Project, and that sort of focus on sort of fixing this massive a problem that is now delayed, and is going to potentially impact what we do in the future. Thank you. So I'm going to pass it back over to Alex. Alex, let's go ahead and start taking questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for that very candid presentation, both to Frank and Peter. So our audience, this is your opportunity to get honest answers to good questions. Feel free to go ahead and place your questions in the chat, or to raise your hand and you can ask them directly. So this is why we have these webinars, so that we can have this interaction.
If we're still waiting for a question, let me ask Jim. Jim, you want to start us off while our audience generates their questions?
Well, thanks. Yeah, and I appreciate your candor here, Frank, on the objectives, and I'm curious as to how we've gotten ourselves into what I think you're explaining as a short-sighted view of the long-term problems associated with the deterrence and our nuclear industry in general. I'm just curious how we've done that since the Cold War mentality, and I know a lot of people use that as a pejorative. We didn't have any. We had no great power wars during the Cold War. So why is that a problem? So I'm curious as to your thoughts as how we got in there and how we get out of that. Thanks.
Well, I think I've given you how we get out of it. I mean, the problem obviously was history was supposed to have ended. We didn't have to worry about defense anymore. Bill Perry brought all the major defense firms together for the Last Supper and started downsizing that, because why do we need two people building fighter aircraft, right? So it was very short-sighted. It was well-intentioned. It was based on a hypothetical view of the world, which never eventuated. Nobody made course corrections. We got ourselves into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and defense secretaries, while rightly focused on troops in combat, didn't want to think about other things. I mean, I remember in 2008, being on the Schlesinger panel as we looked at the problems with the Air Force. And we talked to the Secretary of Defense at the time. And, it was sort of thanks for your interest in national defense. I've got a war to fight. Well, yeah, but we are the United States of America. We ought to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And we just haven't focused on it. And we haven't focused on it. We fought about the modernization program in Obama and in Trump and in Biden. All the while, the Chinese and the Russians are building. Well, it's time to wake up and smell the coffee. They are doing bad things. On the other hand, I'm sorry, I'll keep ranting for just a minute. Why Frank Kendall, who is a smart man, has refused to touch tanker, I simply cannot explain. No idea. Why Del Toro doesn't understand the role of regional nuclear deterrence, I cannot understand. So, the trouble is we've had some failure of people in high places. And as I say, I think from now on, the Secretary of Defense needs to take charge of these kinds of efforts and bring these people in front of him every 3 months and say, what are you doing? And what are you doing to fix it? And if they're not doing well, fire them. That includes admirals in charge of overhauls. I mean, what is it? I think it's the Boise was waiting 7 years to go into a 7-year overhaul. I mean, we can't afford that. Anyway, that's a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alex. You got a question? I saw one.
Yeah, there's a question here from Chris, and it's in the chat. He says, I guess it's to both the speakers, so for Peter and for you, Frank. It says here, which optimal behavior would you expect from allies in Asia, Middle East, and Europe to rebuild an effective deterrence? How not to proliferate? How crucial is space?
Well, Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about Korea and Japan. When you have an administration and think tank community and so forth denigrating nuclear deterrence, particularly extended deterrence, our allies get a little worried. And the Koreans and the Japanese, probably more than any two countries, because of the proximity, not just of North Korea, but there's China and Russia with nuclear weapons there as well. So they're facing three major nuclear powers, or nuclear powers. We won't call North Korea major, but they could. How many weapons they have, I don't know. 25, 50, 100. So their worry then prompts their populations to be worried. In Korea, you got 70% of the people polled say they'd like to have their own nuclear deterrent. The alternative would be the U.S. to bring its nuclear regional deterrent, which we don't have in the Pacific, which is why Frank talks about a Navy cruise missile. You don't have to deploy in country. You can have it in the region, which helps enormously. And you could also have it in the European Atlantic theater. But that's going to take some time. You could move U.S. nuclear forces into Korea. You could have them fly in and base there with their bombers and long-range strike options, which I think Rose Gottmiller suggested in her remarks earlier this year as kind of a near-term thing. So to get deterrence back is very difficult when you've lost it. And you lose it in the minds of your allies. It's not just in the minds of our enemies, because Putin may dismiss some of our deterrent capability, which he obviously did when he went into Ukraine, but he hasn't gone into any NATO country. So it appears that he is deterred here, but he's not deterred there. But the question is, when our allies question it, they want to go in their own direction, which is the nuclear option. And space is just, here's a good question. We have a senior fellow at NIDS, Mr. Stone, and he was a colleague of mine at the Air Force Association. And he says, what we will not do in the services is two things. What military capability do we want to be able to attack the other guy's space assets? And what do we need to do to protect our own? We have this mentality that, well, the use of space should be for peaceful purposes, and it's really bad form to attack the other guy's space assets, but they're critical to effectively fighting any kind of conventional war, let alone nuclear. And therefore, in my mind, that's the first thing the Chinese and the Russians go after. So we have to protect space. And the effect is if our allies have duplicative forces that add to ours and we add to theirs, that makes it much more difficult for an enemy to take actions which would take them out of the game. I've always thought the North Korean nuclear capability, which was, in my view, instituted by the Chinese, was to occupy America in that part of the world to the point where we throw up our hands and say, we're out of here. It's the Doug Bandow approach to nuclear security is if you worry about a fight affecting CONUS and continental United States, you leave. You just get out, which he has advocated just recently in September in a piece of the national interest. So that to me is what the Chinese are up to. They want us out, and they don't want to have to fight us. They want us out before the fight even begins. And that to me means our allies are probably the tether that keeps us there. And I consider South Korea like brothers and sisters, having lived there for a couple of years as a student. They have been with us on every major battle we have fought since, including the Korean War. They're very courageous people. They've talked about an ally devoting an enormous amount to us, but I wish everybody emulated what the South Koreans have done in terms of their support for us. But the allies, even at 2%, is inadequate. That's crazy. There's no reason, if you're talking about survival of your own country, you can't put 4% of your GDP or some number like that. I think Frank's right. What's the output you need? And if the output's 5%, okay, it's 5%. The output's 1.5%, okay, 1.5%, who cares? If I get the numbers I need, that to me is the determining factor as to whether or not our allies are supporting us adequately and whether we're supporting our coalitions adequately. Back to you, Frank.
Thanks, Peter. Let me make 3 quick points. The first is, we talk about integrated deterrence. I don't think we're there yet. Integrated deterrence means making sure that our gray area, our conventional, our nuclear, our space, and our cyber assets are all planned and worked together, because certainly that's what the enemy is doing, both China and Russia. So we need to do more on space, and because we are so dependent on space, we need to proliferate capabilities in space so that a cheap shot doesn't knock us out of the game. I think a second thing is to make sure that we broaden our comments to include all of our Pacific allies, particularly our Australian allies. AUKUS is a great start, but we need to continue to press on it, and we need to expand it. We need to make sure that we do more things. That's what Pillar 2 is all about, but we need to bring in the Japanese and the South Koreans as well. And we need to look after the Philippines, because the Chinese are trying to push them around and get into their EEZ. And I know it's really late, but I would encourage our dear friend Christine Leah to say something. She's one of Australia's top nuclear experts, and if she'd like to ask a question here, I think that would be terrific. Third thing I'd say is that we make everything a massive project. We went from the idea, catch this, the idea of a Polaris submarine with Polaris missiles to deployment in 5 years. Now they're saying we can't have a nuclear-tipped cruise missile for 10 to 13 years. That's nonsense. I mean, if you made this a priority program and you say take maybe the Tomahawks, the existing Tomahawks, and come up with a modification of the existing W-80 warhead in some form or another, or even a new warhead, let's get rolling with programs and not doing things in the bureaucratically comfortable pace of business as usual. Back to the earlier comments. We are really at a crisis point here, and we need to turn defense industry around. That's going to mean government assistance, and it's going to mean that the Secretary of Defense needs to set policy and not let the services go their own way, because the services don't fight wars. COCOMs do, and the COCOMs are left hanging out. Thanks.
Okay.
Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, there's more questions here in the chat. So this one is from Frank Spangenthal. It says he'd like to hear Frank's thoughts on the challenge of the service's ability to provide forces ISO policy with flat budgets, aging platforms, significant personnel and infrastructure costs, and more. With today's budgetary constraints, what do you keep and what do you kill within the services? Or is the plan to significantly increase the top line budget? Maybe both. Additionally, Congress gets a vote, and what is the plan to thread the forces policy needle with those that hold the purse strings?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's raised the budget, but I think it's spend money more wisely. I mean, you look at the story of the Constellation class frigates, where they buy a design that's 80% complete, and they've redone it 80%, and it's now 3 years late. I mean, that's nuts. That's no way to manage a program. I'm sorry, it just isn't. You look at the icebreaker. We can't build an icebreaker, and we certainly can't build an icebreaker for, a lot less money than the Finns are building icebreakers. Buy Finnish icebreakers. I don't care. Get the icebreakers out into the fleet. I mean, so if it requires changing the law, change the law, but realize what the issue is. So the services have to shape up and reform as well. They're wasting a lot of money. They are not exercising good control over their budgets, and they need more money. But you're not going to get Congress to give you more money unless you can prove that you're not wasting money.
Now, Alex, let me respond by, going back a little bit of history. When we were building the C-17, it was about $100 million a copy, more than it should have been. And the reason was that you had labor forces jumping between the C-17 and commercial aircraft, depending on where you got the higher pay. So you had no lessons learned. You had no understanding of the history of each. So each plane was coming off the assembly line with multiple problems, all different. And the cost was astronomical. And a Democratic congressman by the name of Dick Gephardt, who was from St. Louis, where the plane was being built, took the union down and said, look, choose. Go on the commercial flight plane or the C-17 military transport plane. Your choice. But get a force and stick with it. He did. He took $100 million a copy out of the airplane costs. And we built, and the Secretary of Defense at the time, Mr. Aspen, came very close to canceling the program, which would mean we would have no airlift capability beyond the old C5s, which were built in the late 1960s, if everybody remembers. So we can do things correctly. The thing is, you have to have the leadership to say it. It's a good example of the kinds of things we need to do, because Frank's right. Even if we increase the top line, if it takes us 7 to 13 years to bring something from RDT&E onto the field, the Chinese and Russians are building things much faster than we are. And the bad guys are not waiting around for us to get our act together.
But I want to emphasize what Peter just said. He said Les Aspen stepped in. And you see, this is my point. In a way, these key programs are too important to be left to the services. They have to come up to the Secretary of Defense, and don't talk to me about, boards at this level and that level and everybody gets a vote. No, bring it in front of the Secretary of Defense and let the Secretary of Defense hold people to account. It worked for Cap Weinberger.
So I'd like to follow up on that with a question. So service secretaries are politically appointed.
Yeah.
Are they not just simply doing the bidding of their boss? I mean, they are political animals. Is this not presidential direction that says that you will do this or you will not do this? That some of this behavior, no matter how you might want to couch it, isn't actually just part of perhaps the administration's goals of what they're trying to occur. As we've all stated here, it really comes down to priority. We don't do these things because we don't want to do them. And so why is it that we don't want to do this? And so then I think that's the root question is, who's determining that we don't want to do this? And if they're politically appointed animals, does this not really point to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
No, I don't think so. So, I was in the Pentagon for 22 years. 22 years. I dealt with a lot of service secretaries. In my experience, most service secretaries were following their own agenda. Don't really recall interactions with the White House. They would have had to have come through the Secretary of Defense anyway. The Secretary of Defense is the Secretary of Defense because he's supposed to be in charge of integrated military departments. Most secretaries of services follow their own agendas. There is one time, the Reagan modernization program in a presidential directive called for one new Ohio boat a year. One time, John Lehman, who was Secretary of the Navy, said, "Screw it, I don't like the Ohio's. I'm going to skip a year." Well, his palm was returned to him, and he was told to redo it by SecDef, redo it per presidential directive. That's the only time I kind of think that's true. But I think we've come to the time where the Secretary of Defense, you've got three basic consumers, right? You got the nation as seen by the Secretary of Defense. You got the services who do what the services want to do, and you got the COCOMs who get the short end of the stick. And I think it's time for the Secretary to assert him or herself and to get into the business of giving the COCOMs what they need so that they don't have to fight. But if they do have to fight, they have the proper equipment. And I don't think that the service secretaries and the services are aligned with that. I mean, look, just because George Washington established service secretaries and put them in charge of man, train, and equip, doesn't mean we still have to do it that way. And I put the service secretaries on a very short leash.
Okay.
Which is why
Thank you
no
for
one's
that.
ever going to ask me to go back in.
Curtis,
You never know.
I went to work in 1980. I can say it now. I went to work in 1981 for the service secretary of the Air Force. My boss was Gordon Furnell, who was special assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force eventually became peacekeeper, which is known as the MX mission. My job was to tell the secretary, this is the story that people on Capitol Hill, within the arms control community, within industry, think tanks, and our allies believe is on the table with respect to strategic nuclear modernization. And it's a bad story, which is dominated too much by things like the nuclear freeze and arms control and having summits. And the Scowcroft Commission report, which was put together by some extraordinary people, and God bless Jim Woolsey, who wrote a lot of it, it told a different story. And it was a story written in March 1983 that captured, for want of anything, captured the imagination of Congress. And they said, yeah, we can go with that. We do not now have a story. We have a dominant media that goes and says, well, we got a McCurdy breach. We've got a delay in this program. We've got, this thing costs too much money. When Senator Hoeven came and spoke to us in September, he added up the modernization aspect of the nuclear deterrent. That's Columbia, the D5 mods, Sentinel, the proportion of the B-21 that's nuclear, and NC3. Two numbers, one with NC3, one without. Without NC3 was $16.4 billion a year. With NC3, a notional $5 billion, you're up to 21. So ask yourself, out of the nuclear budget of $57 billion, look how much is for the legacy systems, for systems that are old. And as Admiral Richard points out, you only have two choices in this business. If you just go with the legacy systems, you're going to go out of the nuclear business very soon, because the system just simply won't work anymore. Senator Shaheen of New Hampshire pointed out is you can't just say, oh, well, rely on the legacy systems, because someday you're going to wake up and you're going to find out they don't work. So the only other choice, besides disarming, as Clark Murdoch called it, rust to obsolescence, is the only other choice is modernize. And the question is, if you say, oh, you can only spend $20 billion a year or $50 billion a year, whatever the number is, that's the wrong question. Is what do you need to spend to establish and sustain deterrence? And remember, these systems are going to last until 2080. So as I pointed out in an editorial today, is the cost per warhead on alert for modernization comes to $11 million a year. And how many warheads do you want on alert? That's this deterrent standard set by the president, interpreted by the strat commander, and said, okay, Mr. President, you want to do X, Y, Z, this is what you need. And as Frank Miller says, you got to hold at risk what the bad guy's value. And whatever that number is, it costs you $11 million on average for an ICBM or an SLBM or a bomber weapon to be on alert, ready to go in the case, and that's your deterrent. And I tell you what, the idea that that's too much money to spend, as Senator Hoeven pointed out, $16.5 billion a year out of a federal budget of $6.6 trillion. It's a decimal point removed a couple times to the to the right, which is, it's not even a rounding error in some in the federal budget, but it is a lot of money. But on the other hand, as General Mattis says, we can afford survival.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can I make one more point, which is kind of really off topic, but it's on topic?
yes,
we've
of
all
course,
been
Frank.
reading, we've all been reading these horror stories about how our troops are living in houses that are mold infested. How in God's name can you be Secretary of Defense and let that happen? Where is the leadership of our department that you just let stuff happen at lower levels, whether it's submarine production or SLICMN or housing for troops? Where is our leadership? Sorry.
Frank, let me answer that question because I'm going to go back in history. I was asked by General Russ Doherty to be his secretary. We got on airlifters that the Air Force did, and we flew VIPs from the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area around the country to military bases. And in 1981, we found exactly what you just said, mold and deteriorating housing. The VIPs were all pretty important people. They were bankers, industrialists, professors, chairman of departments of academia. And they looked in and said, now I understand what a hollow army was, because this was before the Reagan modernization. But we reported back to the leadership of the White House, and through General Doherty, people listened to what he had to say, and he would write up what we were told. The troops were told, tell these people what you want. Don't worry about the bosses. Don't worry about speaking out of school. Tell us what's going on these bases. We went to Army bases, Air Force bases, went to Navy facilities. And I tell you what, the morale was there because of the new administration. But my God, the status of our infrastructure and our force was an abomination. Is not too, that's a polite way to put it. And it took the leadership in the White House to start pounding the desk and saying, that is not going to stand. I want that fixed in 6 months, or I want that fixed in 90 days. And I think that's what we need. All my military friends who are in this business, they say there's not the urgency yet that this desperately needs to be done. And the bad guys take it seriously. We need to take it seriously.
Leadership.
Yep. Thank you. Alex, back over to you, sir. We might have time for one more question.
Yeah, there's a question from Joe Wolsheimer who I'd like to get in, because I know Joe from a dear friend. So Alex, why don't you just read that too? I think it's for Frank.
Sure. It says, it's for both speakers. It says, did I miss it, or did the foreign minister, who's a big NATO supporter and graduate, not have recommendations for more nuclear relevant capabilities, weapons and delivery means in NATO, and to speeding up the NATO NC3 modernization that has gone nowhere since its inclusion in the 2018 NPR?
I think he meant Frank Miller. Does Frank Miller, who is a big NATO supporter and graduate, not recommend more nuclear relevant
I thought
capabilities?
FM was the foreign minister.
Well, okay. I mean, F-35s are going into NATO. We're going to have modern delivery systems. The B-61-12s are going into NATO. We're going to have modern weapons. I think that's important. NATO NC3 is important. So is U.S. strategic NC3, which is lagging. So yeah, I mean, I can't list everything, but I think also SLICMN is important. I mean, look at all the diversity of Russian theater nuclear systems. And so if you've got U.S. SSNs patrolling in the Baltic or up north with SLICMNs, that helps NATO deterrence too. So I think it's all part of a larger picture where I think we are talking about leadership at the top, driving programs and making things happen, things that are important.
All right. Thank you, Frank. Peter, any last words here as we wrap things up?
No, I want to thank everybody for attending, and particularly my dear friend Franklin Miller, who always tells us wonderful things, things we need to hear. And so
I want to
again thank you, Frank, and thank you, Curtis, and thanks, Alex, for also hosting here. And over to you, sir.
All right.
Thanks
Well,
for
thank
including
yeah.
me too, and Curtis and Alex.
Yes.
Thank you both, and Peter, of course, always. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to have you both here. I can't thank you all enough for being a part of this and for sharing this wealth of knowledge with NIDS and of course all of our listeners and viewers and all of that. Again, I want to thank everybody for being here and just I wish you all a good weekend. And hope that you are able to check us out on our various methodologies. We're on Twitter X and we're on LinkedIn and all the other areas that Alex has already noted. So please check us out and follow us. And we look forward to any interactions with you. Sorry we didn't get to the remaining questions. John Butler, your question looked very interesting. But if you send it to us, or if you're interested, we'll send it over to Frank and Peter, and they can maybe send you a reply and sate your appetite. With all that being said, Alex, over to you for a closeout.
All right. Thank you to the speakers. And our next seminar is in 2 weeks. As I usually state at the beginning of these programs, they normally begin at 10 a.m. Eastern, but in 2 weeks, we will begin at 9 a.m. Eastern. And this will be with Uzi Rubin on November 8th. He is a former head of Israel's missile defense program, and that's going to be the topic of his discussion, Israel's missile defense. So we hope to see you there in 2 weeks. And then also we have an in-person event in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol Hill Club. That is going to be with the Drew Walter, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Matters. That's going to be Friday. We start at 9 a.m. and we finish at 10. I'm sorry, I take that back. We start try to get there before 8 a.m. So we get there 7:45-ish, and we want to wrap up by 9 a.m. so everyone can get to work. So the in-person events run from 8 to 9. The virtual for this coming up in 2 weeks will be from 9 to 10 because our speaker is in a different time zone and to work it out for him. So hope to see you in 2 weeks and also see you at the in-person if you can make it. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Thanks.